coming out. We'll get ourselves started with greetings from England.
Let's call it to order. Barry, want to call it to order?
Are we called to order?
I guess
Okay,
so.
here we go. So, because we were actually, of course, as you know, in England for the Brexit vote.
What is it?
The Brexit vote.
Oh, the Brexit thing. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we were actually at Woodbury Hill in Western England.
Oh, yeah.
And it was quite a feeling to be looking out at England and realizing it had kind of risen again.
Yeah.
And I can supply a copy of this to splice into the video there. But what was really remarkable about all of this, let's turn this off here, is that it was that they were told they couldn't do it. They were told that they couldn't go it alone. That it was just the time for that sort of thing was past, and they didn't believe it. And this is really what stands out to me about the Brexit vote. The big picture is that those of us who may feel that we are fighting a losing battle, well, that's what they were told, and they didn't believe it. And because they didn't believe it, it turned out not to be true. And I think that this is enormously encouraging for all of us who believe in freedom. You remember, before the vote, the possibility was treated with ridicule, and so were the people who advocated it. It's absolute corrosive scorn. You know, I think it's fair to worry about the incivility of public dialogue in the modern world, but I think that a lot of people place the blame in a kind of peculiar spot, particularly given the tone of that referendum. You really did see, pardon me, just having a little fight, here we go, there we are, we're in now. That this was not treated as though it were a rational argument that was going on. And I think, in fact, one of the reasons the exit vote won is because of the way the Remain vote conducted themselves in this regard. Particularly, remember David Cameron as British Prime Minister, who clearly thought that the whole thing was ridiculous. And first he tried to ignore it, and then he promised a referendum to make it go away. And then the referendum didn't make it go away, and so Cameron, he told his backbench MPs not to take a view on it, quote, because of what your constituency association might say. And what is remarkable about that is not that he told his backbenchers to ignore the voters and the party activists, is that he didn't realize that saying so might be regarded in some circles as controversial. That there was a degree of obtuseness about what was happening on the part of the elite that didn't even go away when it passed. And the Remain campaign, of course, they thought of themselves as being the people with all the brains and all the arguments and all the money. And they actually did have most of the money, I think. But the question they were never prepared to answer, and still aren't coming to terms with, is if we are the smart ones, and if we had the better of the argument, how did we manage to lose? You know, I could see you could be very, very clever and still lose an argument because you were wrong. That's one possibility. Or, you know, you could not be very bright and lose an argument even though you were right. But they think of themselves as having been obviously right, and yet they made such a mess of it. And you saw this with David Cameron when the referendum started to go the wrong way. I mean, the polls were starting to look scary. And he went to the EU and said, well, you've absolutely got to give us a better deal. And they said no, and he said, okay. And again, he had no idea how this was going to play out among the people of England. And then he wanted to use public money to campaign against the referendum. And once again, this caused an upset that he didn't see coming. And then the Attorney General started to say, well, maybe I'm going to join the exit campaign because, you know, the EU really does override British law. He said, oh, you can't do that. That's ridiculous. And then after the vote, there was this horrifying scene in the European Parliament, but horrifying in a funny way. And, you know, with the European Parliament, if it's horrifying in a funny way, you figure you're ahead of the game. Because Nigel Farage went to talk to them about how this whole thing was going to play out. And you got the Jean-Claude Juncker kind of going, oh, the British remain our friends, you know, democracy's democracy, we have to respect what they did. And Farage started to applaud, and Juncker whirled on him and said, that's the last time you're applauding here. But he said it in English. We'll see who laughs last. And then he said, the British people voted for the exit, why are you even here? And that's a very revealing question, because the answer is because it still hasn't happened institutionally. That there are actual governance structures here that do function in a certain way, and we need to work through that. And the thing completely, it went downhill from there or uphill, depending on how much you value comedy in public affairs. Farage stood up, he said, good morning, to loud jeers. Thank you for that warm welcome. You all laughed at me. Well, you're not laughing now, are you?
Yeah.
And as the ruckus continued, he said, I know that virtually none of you have ever done a proper job in your lives. And finally, somebody told the European MPs not to be childish, said, you're acting like UKIP. So, my point being that the scorn continues, and the news stories afterwards said, oh yes, well, all those bigots in the UK voted for Brexit. We all know that. Of course, a substantial proportion of British citizens who are not white voted for the Brexit. This is the inconvenient truth that's going there beneath the surface. But people in the UK were reacting, and again, obviously a lot of people voted to remain. The vote was fairly close nationwide. There was a strong vote to remain in Scotland. There was a vote to remain in Northern Ireland. There was a vote to remain in London. But elsewhere in the country, including in Wales, the vote was to leave. And one of the reasons why is that people understood that the EU makes law that binds British citizens, and they didn't want that. And that was really at the center of the argument.
That's right.
And incredibly, given the state of the modern world, a majority in the United Kingdom said we would like to make our own rules our own way.
Yes.
We'd like to, we'll make our own mistakes and we'll try to fix them. And sure enough, and everybody's trying to downplay this. Apparently the EU is set to issue a ban on high-powered kettles, toasters, and hair dryers. It's kind of a, let's not mention this till after the referendum, because people will treat it as though we were meddling in their personal affairs. But one of the things that I saw here, and that's been something that's been on my mind for a great many years. Ever since I was in graduate school, I have been pondering this question of why disagreements on public policy are so deep and on the whole so unproductive. And when I was in grad school, I read a book by Thomas Sowell called The Conflict of Visions, where he'd been wondering the same thing. He said, I've been in the public policy trenches for years, and I keep finding myself lined up with the same people, against the same people, even though we're arguing about things that seem to have no connection. The minimum wage, abortion on demand, or then it was a hot public policy, foreign policy topic, aid to the Nicaraguan Contras. So there must be something that has me over here and Edward Kennedy over there on issue after issue after issue that is deeper than specifics. And he wrote a book, I very much recommend it, and I feel no guilt recommending it because it's short and very, very well written. But he said there's a kind of an instinct in some people that the key to good public policy is compassion. If you care a whole lot, things will turn out right if the good people are in charge. And on the other side, you have the people who worry about methods, who say that we have to rely on what we have learned painfully from the past. We have to understand how things work. And Sowell said the compassion crowd tend to think that peace and plenty are normal, and that war and want are these unusual things that have been caused by some malevolent person, whereas people on the other side, which was his side, think that poverty and conflict are natural. And if you look at the pages of history, you want to figure out why in some places did things actually go well despite the odds. And ever since I read that book, I've been very taken by Sowell's insight. For instance, with the big arguments that were going on in the Reagan years about whether the United States and the West should rearm, and you had bumper stickers, and I think good bumper stickers. One of them saying, visualize world peace, and the other one saying, peace through strength. And it's going to sum up the two positions. And visualize world peace isn't about methods. It's about compassion. It's about the desire in your heart for peace, whereas peace through strength is a method. And I think this explains an enormous amount of what goes on, including, as I say, this tendency of arguments to go past one another or collide at right angles. And when it came to the Brexit vote, there was a conspicuous failure on the part of the Remain people to engage the question of what exactly does it mean to be in the EU? How does the EU work? And is it or is it not a good idea? Should we manage our affairs this way? Apparently, in the run-up, this was in various news stories, and I suspect not accidentally, that the Queen had taken to asking people with whom she had dinner, give me 3 good reasons why we should stay in the European Union. And my own read on this is that Buckingham Palace was gently tilting toward the exit. I don't know that for sure. I did not get to see the Queen while we were in the UK, so she couldn't tell me. But when you look at the arguments that were made for staying in the EU, they fall into 3 heads, but none of them is a very good reason. One of them is, well, the tide of history is against you. It's just not the way things are going. To which my riposte is, I think the obvious one comes from Chesterton, that only dead things go with the tide. And the live person builds a dam, protects the land against the flood. The second one is, oh, well, the advantages of trade. Goods move back and forth, people can go get jobs and so on. But nobody was saying, and nobody is saying, except some angry Europeans, that Britain should not trade with the EU. That was never part of the argument. That was a red herring. Nobody's saying the EU should not trade with Britain. Britain is the world's 5th largest economy. As Farage did say, to more of that catcalling, if you don't trade with us because of the Brexit vote, you're cutting off your noses to spite your faces. And it's possible to create agreements on labor mobility. But there is the question of controlling the borders. What was not addressed properly was, should Britain control its own borders or should it not? And if it remains in the EU, can it control its own borders? And this comes to the larger question, why would you want to be governed by the European Union? And there are 2 parts to this question. The first part, suppose that the European Union actually had a system of government like the British one, and like the one that we used to have. Suppose they had a parliamentary system in which the ministry was responsible to the legislature or elected by the people. Even so, for Britain to join on that scale, they would be 65 million people in a parliament elected by 500 million people. They would have a 1/9 of the seats. Why would it make sense to have decisions about Britain made by a parliament in which they had a 1/9 of the seats? And why would it make sense for Germans to cede their sovereignty to a parliament in which they would have maybe a 1/7 of the seats? Why would Hungarians let Hungarian policy be made by a voting bloc consisting of Germans and English people and Spaniards and others who didn't live in Hungary? But nobody went anywhere near that argument. Nor did they go near the more fundamental point that the EU doesn't work like Westminster. The EU government is so different. I was thinking if there'd been audiovisual stuff here, and I didn't think of asking for this nearly in time, and I would have put it up on the wall, but we'd need a bigger wall. Because the EU governmental structure is so complicated that even as a kind of constitution nerd, I look at this stuff, and then I can't remember it. I have to look down at my notes and say, okay. The EU website says it has a unique institutional setup. And that is one way of putting it. That's like that when you have to write a letter of recommendation for somebody and you just absolutely can't think of anything that will describe the situation. Well, he's a remarkable man, I cannot say enough good things about this person. That sort of stuff. Because there's a European Council. And the European Council provides policy direction. It's composed of the heads of state or of government that are members of the European Union. But it's not the executive branch. It's just these guys who come in and say, do this, do that. Then there's a Council of the European Union. So you've got a European Council and a Council of the European Union. How are we meant to keep these 2 separate? But the Council of the European Union is also not the executive. It's this other thing. I'll put it over here and I'll bring it back later. The executive is the European Commission, which is composed of 1 appointee from each member state, and also the president of this thing is involved in nominating the people. And then the European Parliament, which I promise will show up eventually, gets to vote yay or nay on the entire membership of the European Commission, which is not the European Council, it's the European Commission. It's got the same initials. Thank you very much for that. But this thing, which is the executive, they either accept it holus bolus or else they reject it and everything falls off the table. So in fact, they have to accept it. And then this executive body drafts the legislation. The European Parliament cannot write its own bills. And that is an amazing defect in a legislative body. The British Parliament has been writing bills since before it existed. They began as petitions to the king, would you please stop being an idiot spending all the money? And normally, they were phrased in flowery language, we beseech your majesty, knowing your goodness and compassion, to stop doing this. But in the invisible ink was, or else we'll pick up our swords and hack you to pieces, so don't. And as early as 1400, when Henry IV is trying to become King of England after Richard II has disappeared under mysterious circumstances, he goes to Parliament to say, am I the king or not? And Parliament says, well, we think you're the king. We'll probably call you the king. But here's the deal. Before we make you king, you've got to agree that when we present a petition to you asking you to fix some problem, you're going to answer us on that point before we give you any money. So there's the English Parliament, it's not even the British Parliament yet, initiating legislation to fix problems in 1400. And here's the European Parliament unable to do this in 2016. It's the executive branch, which is going to carry this stuff out, which knows better than anybody except the European Council what should happen, that is saying what bills can even be considered. So this is a complete glaring lack of any connection between citizens and the government, even though they do elect the European Parliament. And then, the Council of the European Union, I put it over here and now it's back. What is this thing? You don't have to take notes. There won't be a quiz on this, but I do think it's worth running through in some detail just to explain how wrong this whole thing was. The Council of the European Union is actually an appointed upper house. The European Union has an appointed upper house. And why is it that all the people who are so rah-rah for the EU and so disdainful of Brexit, and also so scornful of our appointed Senate, don't object to the EU having an appointed upper house? You'd think it would bother them. And the Council of the European Union, this appointed upper house, is also called the Council of Ministers, which sounds like an executive post, because it's actually composed of ministers from each member state. And they rotate. If the subject in front of these people is agriculture, then it's the agriculture minister of each member state who's sitting in the upper house of the legislature. And it actually has more power than the European Parliament, which wouldn't take much doing, but nevertheless, there you have it. So you have an executive that controls the legislative agenda, an upper house that's appointed that dominates the lower house, and a lower house that's basically there to give a veneer of democratic legitimacy. Why would you want to be part of that? And that is the argument that was never really engaged. It was like, oh, everybody who wants out is a rube, everybody who wants out is a trade skinhead, everybody who wants out is a real skinhead. These are the kind of arguments that got made. But nobody stood up and said, it's actually better to have a parliament in which the legislature has no power. Now, obviously you wouldn't want to stand up and say that, but why would you stand up and say we must belong to an organization of which this is the most important feature if you weren't willing to say it out loud? And it is, I think, worth noting that people who run the EU are not conspicuously malevolent people. I mean, not in the Ivan the Terrible mold. They don't go to work in the morning thinking, who shall I disembowel today? But when you look at the people who threatened liberty in the English-speaking world throughout the centuries, like James I, he didn't look in the mirror in the morning and wink and say, hello, evil. He thought, I am better positioned to know what people need than they are. I'm a highly intelligent man, and James was a highly intelligent man. He loved to argue theology with theologians. I have the broad view. He did have the broad view. I have a great deal of worldly experience. He'd grown up at the Scottish court and lived to tell the tale. This was a man who was quick on his feet. He really thought he knew better than the populace what they needed. So did King John. There's a guy who did get up in the morning thinking, who shall I starve to death today? But even there, he thought, because they richly deserve it for not appreciating me. And so the people who ran the EU really did think the world would be better if they were in charge and voters were not given a say because voters are fools. And they had sufficient wit not to really shout that from the rooftops. But they didn't have any sort of political deftness in somehow constructing an argument that really concealed the fact that's what this business was all about. And that's how the cat got out of the bag. And the British people, and yes, I gotta say again, it was a close vote. You know, the gap was 2 or 3 percentage points, but enough people in England said, no, we want to be governed the way we've always been governed, which is the people govern themselves. And given a chance, they voted that way. And they voted that way despite a whole bunch of what amounted not just to condescension, but bullying. People were saying, farmers, you're not going to get your EU subsidies anymore. And, you know, I'd like to think the farmers said, but we are not for sale. It may just be that they didn't believe the argument. Perhaps there'll be some unpleasant surprises in the aftermath. But on the other hand, Britain was paying more into the EU than it was getting out. And from now on, even if Britain still has a ludicrous tangle of subsidies that undermine both the economy and social solidarity, they're going to be happening inside the UK, under the control of the Parliament at Westminster. Instead of, a lot of celebrities, you know, it wasn't just the political and economic elites, the cultural elite had very much turned up their noses at the people who buy the movie tickets. But Michael Caine, who I guess had nothing to lose at this point, did publicly back the Brexit because he objected to faceless civil servants making decisions for the UK. And I think that is so important. There was a piece by Michael Corrin, who may be suspected of instability in his opinions in certain regards, but he wrote a piece in which he said, let me make it abundantly clear that if I had been a resident in the country where I was born and raised, I would have voted for Britain to remain a member of the European Union for all sorts of reasons, which he laid out. But then he said, I am sick and tired of the followers of the current virtue fetish taking to social as well as mainstream media to dismiss those who voted to leave as being stupid, racist, and selfish. It's precisely that smug, contemptuous type of attitude that resulted from the Leave side winning this referendum. And, you know, more power to him for saying that. And what does all this mean for Canada?
John,
Well, I think...
do you want a break?
No, I'm okay. I don't have to breathe. Do you need a break?
You need to eat.
You know, predictions made by historians are of doubtful value unless they concern the past, right? I can tell you what's going to happen in the War of 1812 and you can put money on it, but when it comes to the future, don't invest based on what I say. I think that Britain leaving the European embrace of statist bureaucracy for what the English-speaking world and representative self-government is a very good thing. I think it is an opportunity for us in terms of trade deals. I mean, Barack Obama saying Britain will go to the back of the queue. I like the fact that someone told him that Q is the British word for lineup. Smooth. But nevertheless, the fact is if you had to choose between trading with Britain and trading with France, you'd want to trade with Britain, right? Fifth largest economy in the world, financial hub, land of opportunity. One of the things that triggered the Brexit is everybody wants to go to Britain. Everybody doesn't want to go to France. Everybody doesn't want to go to Germany. But in a larger sense, I think it is encouraging about the willingness of people to take back their destiny. You know, we of course are working on our Constitution project. I'm pleased to say that the documentary is now about 2/3 actually assembled. It still needs the polishing magic of my colleague and wife here, but we are looking at a world in which for the better part of 200 years now, power has been migrating from the people in the legislature to the bureaucrats and politicians and the executive. And the more they gain control in order to do things for us for our own good, the more grumpier we get. And they cannot see that this is the source of the problem. They cannot understand it because like King James or Jean-Claude Juncker, they're so convinced of their own superior virtue and wisdom that they cannot contemplate the possibility that somebody might disagree even wrongly without being mentally and morally defective, which actually in a way is a good thing in your opponents. Overbearing arrogance doesn't win political arguments. And as you know, part of our Constitution project is that we want to do a revised Constitution and put it to people in a referendum. And that is going to get the same horse laugh that the idea of voting to leave the EU got when it was originally proposed. But, as Nigel Farage said, you're not laughing now, are you? I think there's a very real chance that we can get this thing into the body politic and get it in such a way that it slowly starts to gather momentum. Because what is the argument against letting people vote on fundamental matters. And there was one of my colleagues at the National Post, and I'm going to draw a blank whether it was Chris Selly or Colby Kosh. They're both wise and all-knowing individuals, so I'll praise them both. But he said, yes, it's true, sometimes in referendums people cast votes that don't seem to make sense. But he said, has anybody forgotten that it happens in elections too? Is anybody saying don't have elections? Well, in a funny way, of course, people are. The European Union is actually carefully insulated against elections. Yes, you have elections for the European Parliament, but no, they don't matter very much. And in Canada, you have election campaign finance laws that say that during elections, citizens can't talk. Only politicians and journalists. And that is such a, they say, oh, it's a big money for buying elections. Because you, the stupid voter, are for sale. Your brain is, for rent space, or something along those lines. And it's amazing, it doesn't matter how often the wealthier candidate, the candidate with the bigger war chest loses, people still say this thing. But at the bottom, it's an insult to your intelligence and your character to suggest that if you see enough really annoyingly slick ads, you will be helpless. And in all kinds of other ways, there is this attempt to control the electoral process. And it is not compatible with freedom. But I also believe that even though it can feel some days like we are such a small minority in this argument, that the odds are so stacked against us, it remains true that much that we have to say is what people actually still think. And it's a matter of phrasing it in such a way that they are, as Samuel Johnson said, men more often require to be reminded than informed. That we remind people of what they think and dare the people on the other side to make the argument that nobody dared to make about the European Union, that it would be better for you, Rubes, if you didn't govern yourselves because you're not up to the job. That was the essence of the European Union structure, and it was the thing that nobody on the Remain side could defend. And there are a number of spurious arguments that can be made against referenda, and we've seen them all made, especially our Minister of Democratic Institutions. But as you may have noticed, she has been shrinking visibly as she makes these arguments. She's become an embarrassment to the Liberal administration, and they would like to find some way to put someone else in the job, because what she's been saying has been so feeble in the face of that simple question, why can't Canadians make fundamental decisions for themselves? Why would you not consult them on changing the electoral system that we have essentially been using since Simon de Montfort first summoned the Commons into the Parliament in 1265? I mean, the electoral system used to have all kinds of interesting little quirks, like multi-member constituencies or the universities electing MPs, and I like that stuff, but you can't go back deliberately to an eccentric arrangement. You either inherit it or it's gone. But first past the post, that's what we've been using, because it's clear and simple. Who should be our MP? The ayes have it. That's what you do when you're in doubt about the fundamental situation, is you do a show of hands, what John Locke says. It being necessary that the body politic should remain as a body politic, it must all go in one direction, and so you don't have voting systems that send it in three directions at once or it fractures. You vote simple, clear, direct, shall we have this new constitution or shall we not? And so I am very encouraged. There's a very famous line Churchill said about democracy as being the worst form of government except all the other ones. He actually said this, it was on November 11th of 1947, Prime Minister of the UK in the House of Commons, and he said, many forms of government have been tried and will be tried in this world of sin and woe. No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government except all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. But there is a broad feeling in our country that the people should rule, continuously rule, and that public opinion, expressed by all constitutional means, should shape, guide, and control the actions of ministers who are their servants and not their masters. Now, you might have trouble getting a politician to say that these days, but you would not have trouble getting your fellow citizens to agree with it. And in that, of course, when he talks about the ministers being guided by public opinion, the idea in Britain, still then, at least in theory, was that it was the people through the Parliament that controlled the actions of the executive, not as in the United States with their constitution, or in Britain in its ancient constitution with Magna Carta and the common law, that the people through these instruments controlled even what Parliament could do. Now, I do believe that we've reached a point where we can no longer simply leave sovereignty in the hands of Parliament and trust that Parliament will reflect the will of the people. Parliament has been taken over by the executive, a process that's been going on for 200 years, and at this point, it's clear that if we do leave things in that state, we will not control our government. That's why I now agree that we should have a written constitution with a written charter of rights, but one that comes from the people. That's why we want to adopt it in a referendum. That this thing will say what the state can do, and therefore what not only what the executive can do, but what the executive in concert with legislators can do. And take away the power and the temptation to make themselves absolute masters with a Bill of Rights, a Charter of Rights, that is composed of individual rights, not of collective rights to impose upon the individual, and that does not have a bolt hole. No notwithstanding clause, and critically no clause 1 that these rights are guaranteed only to the extent that it can be justified in a free and democratic society.